welcome to chapter 12. And chapter 12, I know that chapters are a bit out of sequence here for your course, but we do this because it makes it better, because we don't cover the whole book. And so we don't do them sequentially. But in chapter 12, we're going to go ahead and do this. And all of this pertains particularly to your course. There's only a few concepts that I borrow from my macro class, and that is how to calculate the unemployment rate and some of the problems with unemployment. So let's go ahead and jump into our first objective, which is understanding business cycles. And most economic textbooks don't really cover this as a separate idea. Business cycles comes from a school of thought in economics, which is the Keynesian economic theorists. Just like there are different religions, there are different followers of particular schools in economics. So your author, Tucker, evidently follows the Keynesian economic theorist. And so therefore he presents this in his text, which is perfectly fine. It's a good thing to know because a lot of economists do use this, but let's just say it's subject to discussion in terms of economic theory. Okay, so our first objective, we're going to explain these 4 phases of the business cycle. You probably have heard of them if you have paid attention to media, because they tend to use some of the terms that you will see here. So a business cycle basically looks at some periods of economic growth. It could be contraction. And basically the reason we're studying it now is because it really looks at what are the changes in real GDP. Okay, so that's kind of what we're interested in. And we know that real GDP has been stripped of inflation. So it really does show the growth of the final market value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given time period. So there are 4 phases of a business cycle. There's the peak, which just as a peak would imagine, that's the top. There's a recession, and that is when real GDP is declining. We're going to find these. There we go. A trough is the very bottom. And a recovery is where GDP is rebounding or increasing in growth. So I'll just put increasing to keep all my terms consistent. Okay, so here's an example, and this book is in your textbook. And again, we take real GDP per year, and notice that the peak is the top portion here. It's when the economy has grown to its height that we think. And then we end up seeing a recessionary period. This is when real GDP is declining. We hit the bottom, which is the trough, and then real GDP is expanding. Again, we hit the top and the cycle starts all over again. And it is in fact a cycle. These can be very short. When you heard perhaps after 2008 talking about a double dip recession, they were talking about perhaps we go to a trough and then we go to another trough. Okay, so these, again, you probably have seen in media. Here's an actual business cycle, and notice it's not always this nice curvilinear form that we present up here in panel A. And again, we can see the 1-year business cycle and the recessions, the troughs, and then here we have expansion, and the expansion, although kind of slow, and then we had extreme expansion. So think about to yourself, what will cause that expansion? And right now we have the same kind of thing happening in our government as we had in 2008. We passed the economic stimulus package in 2009, which is what brought up this real GDP. Right now, if we were to propel this out, we would see because of COVID, we had a peak, and then we were in a recession. Now we're in a trough. And to pull this up, hopefully even higher, we're looking at the stimulus packages, which, the stimulus packages. There we go. And I'll spell it right eventually. Stimulus packages, which help pull up real GDP. And that's what you're doing in terms of your bongo projects. So what is a peak? It reaches its maximum during a recovery. And you might ask, well, how do we know what the maximum is? We're going to talk about that in a later objective, talking about leading, concurrent, and lagging economic indicators. What's a recession? And I've seen this done, I've seen it defined a couple of different ways. Most authors will say where we have 2 consecutive periods of real GDP decline. A lot of them say 3. So again, this is one of those things that's up for discussion among economists, but I think if you go with 2, that works out. We also will see some other indicators happening, the unemployment rate rising, and we might also call that a contraction in the economy. So when does the economy operate in a recession? Okay, that's weird. Again, a recession is at least 2 consecutive quarters, okay, in which there's a decline in real GDP. Remember that we report real GDP monthly. Okay, and so we're looking at 2 consecutive quarters, so approximately 6 months of a decline in real GDP. That decline does not have to be very severe. It just has to be a decline, and that's what we'll call a recession. Now, it used to be that we had the word depression. We don't use that word anymore, and the reason why is because it's all psychological. Is the word depression makes people freak out. And so we got rid of that. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. We might talk about structural recessionary times. That's just a fancy word that, and again, we don't use the word depression anymore because it does make people freak out. When people freak out, they don't buy things. When they don't buy things, it makes it worse. Okay, so here's some examples of the declines that we've had in real GDP over time. If we were to propel this forward, we would see that real GDP right now is stable. It's not declining, but there are some questions about, is it going to decline? If you want to know what real GDP is right now, you can go to the Bureau of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they will explain what real GDP is today. A trough is again where we're at the bottom, we reach our minimum. Normally, as we're going down, and we're in the recessionary period, you're going to see the government try to step in and with monetary or fiscal policy and try to reach the bottom of that trough and come back up. Many times you will also see that the Federal Reserve is the one that's using monetary policy. And the monetary policy might be things like increasing the money supply. And they do that by 3 different ways, which we'll talk about in later chapters. Basically, you would see perhaps a lowering of the interest rate, the real interest rate. You would perhaps see some other things that have to do with the banking sector. I'm trying to keep this broad based because you're going to study it in the course. The banking sector. And so that's monetary policy. Fiscal policy, evidently my spelling has taken the day on. Fiscal policy has to do with passing economic stimulus packages and so on, which we're going through right now with the Biden administration in 2021, passing fiscal policies to put more money in the hands of the consumers so that they can help ensure that we are in fact at a trough and we don't go any deeper into a recession. An expansion is an upturn. It's also called a recovery cycle. And again, all of these are just fancy terms for what is occurring in real GDP. And I think actually let's go ahead and stop this particular share. And I'm going to jump over to the Bureau and take a look at what exactly we're at today. So just give me 1 second here. I wasn't going to do this, but I just changed my mind. Here we go. All right, so let me throw this one over here because then you can see it too, which would be helpful. Okay, so here's the Bureau of Economic Analysis website, and we can go here under gross domestic product and go ahead and read this. Now, again, important to remember, are we looking at real? And we are. So right now it increased at an annual rate of 4.1. 3 is normal. That's kind of steady growth in GDP. And so we're at 4.1. So you can look at it in a couple of different ways. This is why you're seeing economic stimulus being passed, is because we definitely will see. And if we were to draw a trend line here, okay, I can't draw on these particular, oh, maybe I can. Let me see if I can annotate. Maybe I can. Oh, look at that. I can. If we were to draw a trend line, you could see that we have peaks and we have troughs. There's a peak, there's a trough, there's a peak, there's a peak, there's a recession, and there's a larger recession, and there's a recovery, and there's a peak, and now we're going down again. So you can see where we get this information from. Again, this is the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So right now for the fourth quarter, we're up, but the question is, will we remain up? And again, we're not in what you're covering in your courses, you're actually looking at the idea of the 3 consecutive or 6-month pattern here. Economists love patterns. Okay, so that it hopefully gives you an idea about what we're looking at in terms of real GDP and growth in the economy. It is married to unemployment and some of the other factors that we look at as well. And we're going to look at those in upcoming objectives when we talk about leading, lagging, and concurrent economic indicators. Thanks. Have a great day.